The bar was on Sunset Boulevard, 3 blocks from the Elektra Records office, and it was not the kind of place that expected to witness anything significant. It was small and dark and slightly worn, the kind of establishment that had been there long enough to stop trying to be interesting and had settled into the more durable condition of simply being available. On the night of August 18, 1966, it held 4 young musicians who had just signed a recording contract with one of the most important independent labels in American music, and who were now, in the ordinary way of people who have achieved something they have been working toward, drinking to the fact of having achieved it. Ray Manzarek was happy. This was visible and unambiguous. Ray expressed happiness with his whole body, leaning forward across the table, speaking with the particular animation of someone whose excitement is genuine and whose vision of what comes next is already formed and detailed. He talked about the album they were going to make, the sound he had in his head, the way the recording studio was going to let them do things that the live shows, the London Fog residency, the Whiskey A Go-Go sets had only approximated. He was 26 years old, and he had been working toward this moment with the focused determination of someone who understood that talent required opportunity, and that tonight, finally, the opportunity had arrived. John Densmore was happy in a quieter way, the drummer's happiness more contained, more aware of what could still go wrong, but genuine. He had been in enough bands that went nowhere to understand what a record deal represented, not a guarantee, but a possibility that had not existed yesterday. He drank his beer and listened to Ray and added, occasionally, the particular observations of someone who was paying careful attention to everything around him and filing it away. Robby Krieger was 20 years old. He had joined the band less than a year earlier, the youngest member, still in the process of understanding what he had become part of. He was happy in the uncomplicated way that young people are happy when something they hoped for has actually happened directly, without the hedging that comes later when experience has taught you that good things carry complications. He looked around the table at the people who were now officially his bandmates on an Elektra Records contract and felt something that he would later describe simply as right. This was right. This was where he was supposed to be. And then he looked at Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison was 22 years old. He was sitting at the edge of the group, not separated from them, not withdrawn in any dramatic way, but slightly apart in the manner of someone who is present in a room and simultaneously elsewhere. He had a drink in front of him that he was not particularly attending to. He was not talking. He was watching the others with an expression that Robby Krieger would spend years trying to accurately describe in interviews, and that he would always find he had not quite captured, not sadness, not detachment, not the performed melancholy of someone who wants to be seen to feel things differently from the people around them. Something quieter and more specific than any of those. Something that looked from the outside like a person watching the beginning of something and already somehow feeling its end. Robby moved closer to Jim and sat beside him. This was not a calculated gesture. Robby was not a calculating person, which was one of the things that made him both a remarkable musician and an unusually honest witness to the events he was part of. He simply moved closer because he wanted to be closer, because something in Jim's expression had pulled him in the way that things pull you toward them when you sense they contain something important that is not yet being said. He said, "You don't look like someone who just got a record deal." Jim looked at him, that particular look, the one that made people feel simultaneously seen and uncertain about what being seen by Jim Morrison actually meant, held for a moment, and then something in it shifted into something more direct. Jim said no. Robby said no. "You look like someone who's somewhere else entirely." Jim was quiet for a long moment, at the table. Across from them, Ray was describing the studio in specific detail, the console, the reverb capabilities, the way the recorded organ would sound different from the live organ in ways that would open up possibilities. John was asking clarifying questions. The ordinary, warm noise of a celebration in which 3 of the 4 people present were fully, simply present. Jim listened to all of it and then said to Robby, quietly enough that only Robby could hear, "I feel like I'm watching the beginning of something that's already ending." Robby Krieger did not know what to say to this. He was 20 years old. He had not been given, by the experience he had accumulated so far, the equipment to respond adequately to what Jim Morrison had just said to him. He understood that the statement was serious, and that it had come from somewhere real, and that Jim was not being dramatic. Jim Morrison was, when he was being observed closely enough and by the right person, one of the least dramatic people Robby had ever encountered. The performances were dramatic, the poems were dramatic, the person in the close quarters of an actual conversation was direct and precise and not given to statements he did not mean. Which meant that what he had just said, "I feel like I'm watching the beginning of something that's already ending," was exactly what he meant. Robby said finally, "That's a strange thing to feel tonight of all nights." Jim looked at the drink in front of him and then at the others at the table and then back at Robby. He said, "Probably, but I've never been good at feeling the right thing at the right time." And then he smiled, not the famous smile, not the performed smile of the rock and roll persona that was just beginning to coalesce around him, but a smaller and more human one, the smile of someone who has said something true and knows it is true and is willing, in this moment, to let the truth stand without qualifying it. Robby smiled back. They sat together in that bar on Sunset Boulevard while Ray talked about the studio and John asked questions, and the night moved forward, and the Elektra Records contract existed in the world, and Jim Morrison had already, in some essential way, understood something about what that contract was going to cost that the rest of them would not understand for years. But to understand what Jim Morrison felt in that bar on the night of August 18, 1966, you have to understand what had led him there and what he had already learned before the album was made and before the first audience screamed his name and before the image of the Lizard King had been constructed and inhabited and found too large to live inside. Jim had come to music through poetry. This is the fact that everything else rests on, the fact that gives the Sunset Boulevard bar and the Elektra contract and the feeling of watching the beginning of something already ending its full weight. He had not set out to be a rock musician. He had set out to be a poet, the kind of poet who understood, from his reading of Rimbaud and Blake and the French symbolists, that language pressed against the limits of what it could say was the most honest possible use of human consciousness. The poems came first. They had always come first. And when Ray Manzarek had said set them to music on the Venice Beach Pier in the summer of 1965, Jim had understood immediately that the music was a vehicle for the poems, a way of reaching people with what the poems were saying, a way of closing the distance between one interior life and another that the printed page closed only partially and imperfectly. What the Elektra contract represented, and what Jim understood in that bar in a way the others did not yet understand, was that the vehicle was about to become the destination. That the music was going to attract an audience that would define what the music was required to be, and that what the audience required was not poems but a certain kind of performer, and that the performer and the poet were not the same thing and could not be made to be the same thing, and that the gap between them was going to grow as the audience grew, and that the growing of that gap was not going to stop simply because he understood it was happening. Ray Manzarek understood the music, as a beautiful and serious and genuinely important art form that could do things that other art forms could not. His understanding was not wrong, but it was different from Jim's understanding, and the difference was significant. Ray saw what they were building as the thing itself. Jim saw what they were building as the means to something else, and he was already, in the back of that bar on Sunset Boulevard, trying to calculate what would happen when the means became so large that it obscured the end. John Densmore understood performance, the relationship between the musician and the audience, the electrical circuit that completed when a band was fully present and the crowd was fully receiving. His understanding was also not wrong, but it was again different from Jim's. John saw the circuit as the achievement. Jim saw the circuit as the beginning of a dependency that neither the band nor the audience would be able to simply choose to end. Robby Krieger, sitting beside Jim in that bar, understood something different from either Ray or John, something closer to what Jim was feeling, though he did not yet have the framework for it. Robby understood intuitively that Jim Morrison was not quite the same kind of person as the rest of them, that what Jim was bringing to the band was not just a voice and a stage presence, but a whole interior world that the band was going to be the vehicle for, and that interior worlds carried their own requirements and their own costs that were not the same as the requirements and costs of building a career. He did not say any of this to Jim that night. He was 20 years old and the language for it had not yet formed. He sat beside Jim and looked at the others and felt, faintly and without being able to name it, the thing that Jim had named. Directly that something was beginning that was already, in some sense, ending, that the contract on the table was also a door closing, that the career they were embarking on was going to be, for all four of them, but especially for the person who would be its public face, something that gave and took in ways that were not yet visible, and that would not become visible until it was too late to renegotiate the terms. Ray Manzarek raised his glass and the others raised theirs, and they drank to the record deal and to the album and to what was coming. Jim Morrison raised his glass too. He drank, he smiled the smaller smile. And he sat in the back of a bar on Sunset Boulevard while the night continued around him, already inside the distance between what it looked like and what it was, already feeling the weight of the beginning that was also an end with only Robby Krieger close enough to notice and young enough to not yet understand what he had noticed. It would take him years to understand. By the time he did, Jim was gone, and the thing Jim had felt in that bar, the watching of the beginning from inside the knowledge of the ending, had turned out to be not pessimism and not performance, and not the dramatic posturing of a young man who wanted to seem more complex than the moment. It had turned out to be simply true. The beginning had ended as beginnings do, and the person who had seen it coming had been the one least able to stop it. Robby Krieger still plays guitar. He has given hundreds of interviews about Jim Morrison in the decades since Jim's death, and he is consistently careful and consistently honest in those interviews, neither mythologizing Jim nor diminishing him, holding the complexity without, simplifying it into something more manageable. When interviewers ask him what Jim Morrison was really like, he often returns, after a pause, to the same night, the bar on Sunset Boulevard, the Elektra Records contract, the others talking about the studio, Jim sitting slightly apart watching, and the thing Jim had said to him quietly that Robby had not known how to answer. I feel like I'm watching the beginning of something that's already ending. Robby says he has thought about those words many times in the years since. He says he is not sure he understands them completely. He says he is not sure Jim understood them completely either, that they were the kind of true thing that arrives before the understanding, that lands before you know what it means, that turns out to have been right in ways that the person who said it could not have fully intended. He says that is what made Jim Morrison different from anyone else he has ever known. Not the performances, not the image, not the mythology, the capacity to feel the shape of something before it arrived, and to name it honestly and to go forward anyway into the beginning that was already ending, with his eyes open and his glass raised and the smaller smile on his face. That smile, Robby has never found a way to describe it adequately. He says it was the smile of someone who knows the truth and has decided, for reasons that only they fully understand, to proceed in spite of it. What the Sunset Boulevard bar held that night, in addition to the four musicians and their glasses and the ordinary celebratory noise of a milestone reached, was something that most of the people in it could not have named, and that would only become nameable in retrospect, the last moment before the transformation. The last evening in which Jim Morrison was simply a 22-year-old poet-turned-musician who had just signed his first record deal, before the record was made and the single was released and the album charted and the image attached itself to the person, and began its long process of becoming something larger than the person could contain. There would be other evenings that felt like this, ordinary evenings in the 2 years before the fame arrived fully, evenings in rehearsal rooms and in the Whiskey A Go-Go and in the apartments of friends, evenings in which Jim Morrison was still recognizably the person he had been on the Venice Beach Pier in 1965, the person who wrote poems in notebooks and argued about Nietzsche and watched European films with the focused attention of someone mining them for tools. Those evenings existed, and they mattered, and the people who shared them with Jim carried them forward as evidence of who he had been before the mythology consumed the biography. But the Sunset Boulevard bar was the last of a particular kind of evening, the last in which the future was still genuinely open, in which the Elektra contract had just been signed and the album had not yet been made, and the audience that would define what Jim Morrison was required to be did not yet exist and had not yet made its demands.